Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my evening interview program, Night of the Notables. Tonight we have the rare opportunity through time travel to interview a disparate group of famous people from previous times. Let's get started right away and meet these famous people who've come together to tell us more about their lives. Miss Nellie Bly, can you tell us about your life?
Yes, I'm Nellie Bly. My real name is Elizabeth Cochrane, and I was born in Pitts Mills, Pennsylvania, later known as Cochrane's Mills. I was born in the late 1800s and lived to be 60 in the early 1900s. And today I am remembered as one of the first women reporters to gain publicity.
Thank you. And a fellow writer, but from across the pond in England, Mr. James Herriot. Welcome.
Hello. I live from the early 20th century to the late 20th century, writing about my job as a veterinary surgeon. And James Herriot was not my name at birth, it was my pen name. My real name was James Alfred White.
Okay, and very much like Nellie Bly, you used a pen name. Louis Braille, you were involved in writing of a different sort. Tell us about your life.
I am Louis Braille, and I am known for creating the Braille alphabet or code. No. And I would write books that people would read to me and punch them out in Braille code.
So you were blind, correct?
Correct.
Well, today many people can read because of you, Mr. Braille. And where did you live?
I lived in France, actually.
And we have yet another writer visiting us with us this evening. Alexander Hamilton, you were also a writer, is that correct?
Yes, but that's not all I'm known for. I lived from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s, and I'm known as one of the founding fathers of the U.S.
And you were the author of the Federalist Papers, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And from further back, we have, but also from Europe, as is Louis Braille, we have Ferdinand Magellan. Hello and welcome.
Hello, I'm Ferdinand Magellan. I was born in 1480 and later died in 1520 on a ship off the coast of the Philippines. I'm best known for the first man to circumnavigate the world.
One of the early explorers, thank you. And also next to you, we have from much further back in time, a person also with two names, Siddhartha Gautama and Buddha. Welcome, tell us about your life.
Hello, I am Buddha. My birth name was Siddhartha Gautama. I was born in Kapilvastu district, Nepal in the late 400 BC, and I died in, no, dang it, I messed it up. I was born in the late 500 BC, and I died in the late 400 BC.
So you lived much earlier in time than the rest of us. Thank you, Buddha. It occurs to me that many of you, famous people from the past, had to overcome hardships and had a great deal of difficulty proving yourselves. That was certainly true for you, wasn't it, Louis Braille?
Yes, very, very true.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, you see, I wanted to make the Braille code, but people would not let me. They just wanted kids to use these raised up letters. And by the time you got to the end of the sentence, you forgot what was at the beginning. So I had to make something that was much smaller, easier, and quicker, and less expensive. But people did not support me. So there was even a man at my school, I became a teacher, that burned all my books and things I had with the Braille code.
Your work was burned?
Yes.
So what did you do?
Well, you see, there are these boys in the school, and they believed in me, and they helped me get through it all. There's also another teacher that helped me as well.
We're relieved that you were able to carry on, Mr. Braille. And Ms. Bly, you also faced a lot of discrimination, but for a different reason, correct?
That is correct. As one of the first women reporters, I was often kicked out of jobs, and many people did not think I could do stunt journalism. So I had a very hard time with that. However, I did become quite famous near the end of my life.
So how do you think you were able to convince your publishers to allow you to write more than just fashion pieces? Isn't it true you were in the beginning just only allowed to write for women's columns?
Yes, I found an insulting article in a newspaper one day, and I decided to write to the editor. And he invited me to come and write a paper, and I chose a subject not often written by women. And he decided to hire me after. However, I very much enjoyed my job. However, near the end of it, he pushed me to simply start writing things that women would normally write, fashion, gardening, and I decided to quit. From there, I was a bit of a freelance author. I had a very hard time getting hired again.
But you persevered, and we're glad you did, especially women reporters like me today. Now, Ferdinand Magellan, you also had a very hard time being accepted for what you wanted to do. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. I was born in Portugal, and up until at like age 13, I was sent to the Portugal Academy to study the arts of a page and all. But I wanted to sail, and the King John would have let me sail, but then he later died at my age 15, and King Manuel I became king, and he was not as open to sailing. It was very struggleful for me to manage to sail, so I had to go on a trip to Spain so I could find someone to sail. So I sailed for Spain, however, I later died on that ship.
So you had to prove yourself as well.
I did. I had to prove to the King of Spain that I had a legitimate route.
Now, weren't you also, like Louis Braille, discriminated against because of a handicap, of a lame leg?
I was allowed to go on a couple voyages for the King of Spain. However, on one of those voyages, I got injured in the leg, causing me to limp for the rest of my life. The king would not accept me after that, so he would merely mock me whenever I would ask him to sail. So I voyaged to Spain on a very lame leg.
And I'm noticing that some of you famous characters were born very poor and some were born very wealthy. How did that help or hinder you in your life? Buddha, how did that manifest in your life?
Well, I was born rich. My father was king and my mother was queen. And I had everything usually anybody could ask for, but I gave it all. I got married, and right after my first child was born, I left and gave it all up to go try to find enlightenment.
So do you think you would have had the ability to think about and seek enlightenment had you been born in one of the lower castes and been poor?
I think I would have been able to do that if I was born poor, because everything that influenced me I saw in the town and not in the palace.
I see. What about you, James Harriet? Weren't you also born poor?
I was born poor, but my family was not poor enough to make it super hard for us. We managed to scrape by, and even when my father was laid off from his job at the shipyards, my mother still supported the family with singing lessons piano lessons, and a dressmaking company. And they managed to pay me through high school and college. So I have them to thank for that.
And Nellie Bly, you were born wealthy, is that correct?
That is correct. My father was very wealthy, and he married my mother, Mary Jane. And let's see, they had 5 children, and I had, I believe, 15 brothers and sisters. It's a bit hard to remember, honestly, so many. But unluckily, he died when I was 6, and my mother, of course, had to remarry, as women could not have as much right as other men for getting an inheritance. She had an unlucky option though, and she married a man who we quickly found was often drunk. When I was 14, my mother finally got divorce papers put together. From then on, we were comfortable, but we weren't rich anymore.
So do you think the wealth that you were born into gave you an advantage in at least knowing about education or not?
Yes, I think it was. I went to boarding school before my father died, and that was much of my schooling before I went off to college.
Now, Alexander Hamilton, you were abandoned by your father at an early age as well, or lost your father at an early age as well, correct?
Yes. So my mother couldn't marry who was said to be my father because she had already been married and they weren't allowed to marry twice. But he left us when I never even met him actually. But then I was married to a rich family, and that helped a lot.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to leave the West Indies where you were born and into poverty, how you ended up in New York?
I was working a lot of jobs, and a company also helped pay for it, part of it. But mostly it was that I had to just constantly be working. And then when I finally got to America, I met Eliza Schuyler, and she had a very rich family. So after we got married, I was able to have a lot more opportunities.
I see. And now, Buddha, we have been discussing some people who lost their parents at a very young age. And I'm struck by how your own son lost you when he was a baby, when you decided to leave to seek enlightenment. How do you feel about having abandoned your child? Or do you see it that way?
I feel like it was something bad, but I had to pursue my dream. And I think it might have been better that he doesn't remember me, and it's not like he had great memories of me, and then all of a sudden I'm all gone. And also, my mother died 1 week after she gave birth to me. And then one of my father's other wives, he had like 3 wives or something, she abandoned her child and gave her child to a handmaiden to become my parent because I guess she wanted the publicity of me being great when I grow up.
I see, I see. Now, many of you had hardships that you had to overcome. Who do you think in this group had some of the greater hardships? What would you say? Louis Brill, do you think you had greater hardships than others because you were blind?
Probably mentally, yes.
Can you tell us more about that? What was it like for you? I don't think our viewers know how you were blinded.
Yeah, I poked myself in the eye with a knife of some sort. I can't recall because I was 3.
You were 3 years old at the time?
Yeah, I think I was 3 or so. I'm not sure when I became blind. That's just what my father told me. Anyways, I poked myself in the eye somehow and became blind for the rest of my life. And I would say, in some ways, mentally abused by other people.
You were mentally abused. In that era, people did not have high expectations for people with disabilities. Now, Mr. Magellan, you were not born poor. do you think that your wealth enabled you to accomplish the great deeds you accomplished?
I think it did. My great wealth allowed me to have an amazing education, which gave me, which was such as cartography and map making, allowing me to become a very good captain and sailor. So if I had not had the education I did, I would not have thought I would have been able to be the general captain of a fleet around the world.
I see. So now, Mr. Harriet, you had hardships as a child or as a young man. Can you tell us a little more about that? Mr. Harriet?
Yes, not many hardships as a child, except for the fact that I really don't know. I had a fairly comfortable childhood
But
in
then,
that the place that I lived,
but didn't
I
your
could,
father lose his job as well?
yes, but again, my mother supported the family very well after he lost his job, and he still did some odd jobs around town to bring in some extra money.
So, Buddha, you endured extreme hardships. Can you tell us more about why you actually chose that path and what was the purpose of those hardships?
I vaguely remember that.
Your hardships involved fasting. I think I've read that you gave up a lot of earthly pleasures and comforts.
Oh yes. So after I left the palace, I cut my hair and traded my royal robes for simple robes to be a beggar, and I didn't get much food. And after a while, I started getting followers because I was so into meditating. And then I was fasting, but I had almost starved. But a little girl came and gave me a bowl of rice and milk. And that's when I decided that if I fasted and tried starving myself, I would die accomplishing nothing. And I lost all my followers because they lost faith in me and that I wouldn't be, I wouldn't get the enlightenment later because of how I stopped fasting. And I almost starved a couple times, but I kept on managing to get by with my little scraps.
So now, Mr. Magellan, I have heard you say that you didn't really think Buddha's fasting counted as a hardship since Buddha chose it himself.
Well, yes, I do not completely understand the point of a hardship if you understand the hardship, that you will be going through the hardship. As in, it's not a hardship if you are allowing it. So I do not believe that is a completely fair hardship. As of me, I had to sail completely around the world, most time without food, because we lost a ship of traders and mutiny.
But didn't you choose to sail around the world?
I did choose to sail around the world. I suppose that is true, but I was not expecting it to be so hard. Maps said that the Pacific Ocean would not be as grand and huge as it was. In reality, it was the largest ocean on the earth. So we expected it to be a 2-year trip. It ended up being, as far as I can recall from my 17 last sailors, it was a 3-year trip with barely any food and scurvy. Scurvy was a very painful hardship. So those were hardships that came along the way. I also believe that other people such as Nellie Bly had hardships that weren't her fault. So I think those are their hardships. But hardships chosen do not seem like legit hardships to me.
Mr. Braille, did you have a comment?
Buddha, you're telling me that you got followers by sitting there with your eyes closed?
We're having.
So that seems confusing to me.
I can't understand your question.
Well, we're having a little trouble understanding your question, Mr. Braille. There, can you try again? Please repeat your question.
Buddha said that he got followers by meditation. But I had to work for my followers and do the Braille code for people to actually realize that it's good, because all the people that followed me were blind as well. They understood how hard it was. But Buddha sat there with his eyes closed, practically sleeping. I'm confused on how they got so many followers.
What is your response, Buddha?
I didn't choose for my followers to follow me, but they also were very interested in meditating. They saw how perseverance I was into becoming enlightened and to learn more about meditating and the spiritual world. That they admired me, and I guess I inspired them.
So it was a different kind of inspiration than Louis Braille had. Now, Nellie Bly, several people have referred to your hardships that you chose when you covered the insane asylum. Can you give us a little more information about that project?
Correct. So after my first job as a reporter, I took several months to try and find a new job. And finally, the editor of the newspaper The World decided to hire me for a sort of test to see if he'd prefer to hire me for a more long-term job. And he assigned me the job of going to an insane asylum that had reports of abuse. So I would go undercover and get inside and report from the inside.
And so how long were you in the insane asylum? And did everyone believe that you were insane?
I was in the asylum for 10 days before a lawyer came to get me out. And all the doctors believed I was insane. There were several women inside of the asylum that simply spoke foreign languages. It was a very bad situation, and I was very glad to be able to report it.
Were you frightened while you were in the insane asylum?
Yes, I was very frightened because I was worried that the lawyer would not come, because I can't remember correctly, but I'm quite sure he was supposed to come after a week. However, I kept waiting and waiting. And then after he came, I was worried he wouldn't be able to get me out, because the asylum kept most of their patients for a very long amount of time.
And is it true that conditions in the insane asylum changed after you wrote your expose?
Yes, conditions changed very much. All the foreign women were let out. A lot of nurses were fired, and food and living conditions were improved greatly.
Was the insane asylum only for women?
Yes, I believe there were 2 asylums, one for men and one for women, so they were separate.
So in asking Nellie Bly if she was ever frightened, I'm wondering if any of the rest of you were frightened at times. I know Alexander Hamilton, when you were fighting in the Revolutionary War with George Washington, was that a frightening situation?
It was at first, but then I started getting more men and I started advancing in the ranking system. And I ended up becoming George Washington's right-hand man. So I was doing less fighting then and more writing. So yes, it was frightening at first, but by the end, we won. So.
And what about you, Mr. Magellan? You certainly had a lot of frightening situations in your life. What do you think your most frightening situations were?
Well, I think some frightening situations were, once again, me traveling the Pacific. Nobody knew how long it was going to stretch out for, and months after months, we just kept rolling. We didn't know when it was going to stop. We were running low on food, and scurvy hit us. So it was a very frightening situation because we were afraid that we were going to lose our whole crew. And it was also very frightening seeing the army that killed me, I was very stubborn to go say that we should go conquer it because they were 30 times our size. And it was very frightening, and unfortunately, I couldn't escape. So we had some frightening times along this ship journey and during our war, but we somehow got through them, and I'm very grateful for that.
So tell us more about your death and the battles that you led your soldiers into that caused that death. Where were you and
Well, when I arrived in the Philippines, I started to conquer, or not conquer, but make some neighboring tribes believe that Christianism is the way to go. And most of them agreed, except for this one tribe. And I very much want them to agree. So I was also serving a king because that one tribe had my king friend who was very loyal to me, and the tribe that didn't want to become Christian, they were somewhat harassing his smaller tribe. So I sent my men to go defeat the tribe. However, once we got on the shoreline, we realized how huge the army was and nowhere near enough for our fleet. So we tried to retreat. However, I was too slow with my lame leg, and I unfortunately got stabbed to death. But
so do you think it was a reckless move to take your men ashore? In retrospect,
seeing it now, I very much do think it was a reckless move for just Christianity, and that without even realizing who my opponent was, just coming along and screaming, "You must be Christian." I think that was a very reckless move looking back today.
And Alexander Hamilton, you died a rather violent death through your own recklessness too. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I would say so. I got challenged to a duel by Aaron Burr because of the election of 1776. Wait. I can't quite recall which election it was, but I voted for Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr thought it was a personal thing, and he challenged me to a duel, and I accepted, and I regret it now, but it was my own act.
Tell me more about your son who also died in a duel.
Yes, so my son was challenged someone to a duel, and I told him to aim for the sky because if the guy who challenged was a worthy man, he would also aim for the sky, but he got shot, and then I tried to do the same thing in my duel, and I also got shot.
Sounds like not everyone followed the gentlemanly rules of the duel. Now, I'm wondering, James Herriot, were there times in which you ever experienced fear, or were you frightened? I'm thinking of times when you were out in the middle of the night trying to save the life of an animal in your veterinary practice.
I mean, of course I was afraid when there was such a thing as like a large farm animal like a bull charging at me or charging at other animals. But other than that, I'd say I wasn't afraid of much. I didn't have much to be afraid of in my life,
I've
except
read
rampaging farm animals.
I've read that you were a sensitive man and found it hard when you lost any of your animal patients.
Yes, I did.
Now, Buddha, what about you? Did you experience fear during all those days and nights that you sat alone under the lotus tree?
I don't think I experienced much fear in my life. Not that anything that I can remember. I was mostly a calm person.
Which was the point of enlightenment, to banish fear, is that correct?
Yes, I also had to face Maya, the goddess or the devil of envy and like evil, and I was a little bit afraid of that, but I got past it.
So it strikes me that most of you were very determined people. I think we'll finish up our program by having each of you describe how you were determined. It strikes me that you are famous because of your determination, perhaps your courage. Let's start with you, Nellie Bly. In what ways were you determined?
I believe I was determined partly because as a woman, I was not accepted to many things. I was very determined to get my job, and I was very determined for many of my stunt journalisms. Besides doing my asylum, I also visited Mexico and other countries to report from there. And I also did a race around the world to beat Jules Verne's character, Phileas Fogg, who traveled in 80 days. I went around in 72 days. But I believe I was very determined, especially because of the writing jobs that were not available for women.
Thank you. And Louis Braille, you were certainly a determined man, even though your life was a short one. In what ways do you think you were determined?
Well, you see, all my friends were telling me that I should stop trying to make the Braille alphabet, but I didn't listen. I just stopped eating and sleeping for a bit just to figure it out. And then I would figure something out, and then it wouldn't work. So it'd be back to the drawing board.
And that happened to you more than once, isn't that right?
More than once, yes.
And what about you, Alexander Hamilton? In what ways were you determined? Alexander Hamilton, in what ways do you believe you were determined?
I believe I was determined in many different ways. I was determined to make our country a free country, so that my family could grow up in a free country and we wouldn't be stuck with the Brits owning us. But I think that I was also determined to write and just keep on writing, so that when I died, they would have lots of documents about me, and they could say what I really wanted to say.
So your belief in democracy could be viewed over and over again through the Federalist Papers, is that correct? Yes. And in what ways were you determined, Ferdinand Magellan?
Well, others would have said it was very unwise to just, because if Spain had not let me sail for them, I perhaps would have gone to many other countries, voyaging to find a country to let me sail. So others would say it was very reckless and unsmart to even sail itself, but to find a place to sail and then actually sail the route around the world into unknown waters. So I would say I was very determined by not stopping to find a way to sail and not stopping and turning back, unlike the mutinous ship.
And how about you, Buddha? In what ways were you determined?
I was very determined into becoming enlightened and making the world a better place, even when it became very hard and I had to eat cow dung and fasting and starving. I never gave up, and I never went back home to regain my old life just because it was easier. I kept on going, and after a while, after I became enlightened, I traveled around the world and teach a lot of people, and that's how the Buddhism religion started.
Thank you. And James Harriet, in what ways were you determined?
I was determined to do my job, do it well, and save animals and help people and animals out. And yeah.
And what about writing. Now, how many novels is it that you wrote?
Well, I wrote in the best-selling series that I wrote, there were, I think, 4 books. There were 4 books. But I also wrote a lot of other books in my college days and young adulthood. Whereas I wrote All Creatures Great and Small when I was in my later life.
Do you think your writing took determination?
I think any writing takes determination.
I think many writers here would agree with you. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time this evening. I'm sure our listeners and our viewers would like to know more about all of you, and there are many books from which they can learn more. Thank you, all of you, for being with us this evening. Good night.